And love never runs out. Well, we have the chairman of the board of Piedmont, pastor of Vienna Baptist Church, my good friend Jeff Clawson, preaching for us. Welcome him as he comes.
Well, good to be with you. I love coming here to speak, and in a lot of ways it feels like home. And I don't know how many times I've been here, but since about 2009, I moved here. From Richmond in 2009, moved about 7 years before that from D.C. Metro, where I grew up, and I'm getting used to things around here. But it's great to see. It's great to see so many new faces today. And so let me just tell you kind of what my goal is when I come here. Really, if you guys leave out of here thinking about something, talking about it, and really thinking about how awesome Christ is, then that's a win for me. So that's the goal really that I want to have. I want to get you thinking. I want to get you thinking about what you believe, and really want to work out that with you today. And so do something a little different. Let me take you to Acts chapter 14. Usually when I preach, I'm very expositional, and I take a text and I tear it apart and have fun with it and bring the themes to the top. But I want to just kind of prove a theme to you today from the text in Acts, just this history, and I want to talk about and really mess with the way you think a little bit. And so that's kind of my goal today. I want to mess with your head and mess with the way you think and make you think about the way that you think. And pastoring, I've been pastor for almost 7 years now, is one thing I realize, especially the church that I pastor is, I don't know what the average age is, but it's fairly young, especially compared to what it was 7 years ago. When I got there, it was probably 60. 65, it's probably 35 now or something like that, but it's gotten younger and younger and younger and younger. But what's interesting about what I learned about the way people think is that I'm 44, I know to you I'm stinking old, but as a pastor I'm still considered pretty young. And the thing about it was when I started to preach and I started to take truth and lift it up out of the scripture and then started to challenge the way people think, live, walk, talk, do church. Here's what I learned. When you mess with the way people think and you mess with how they think about certain things, it can get volatile. People just don't like you messing with the way they think. I don't know if you know that or not. I think it's true for me. It's probably true for you. And it was true in Paul's day. Paul found this out. If you're paying attention to the book of Acts and watching what's happened, not just Paul, but all the apostles, and they start declaring this gospel, and it begins to challenge everything. When they started to declare the gospel, it challenged everything. The framework with which people thought, it started to mess with that and challenge it. And that's why so many of them were getting run out of town, stoned, whipped, beat, and everything else, and thrown in jail because people don't like you messing with the way they think. And I get that. And if you're like me and we're like the rest of the world, we don't particularly care with people messing with the way that we think. But what I want to bring you to is there's a truth to this. You have a developed framework on how you view the world. You have a specifically developed framework on how you look at what's going on around you. You have a framework on how you view history and what that means. And you have a particular framework in your mind, how your mind is built around your condition of your culture, and there's a lot of things that are and part of that make you look toward the future and how you view the future. And I can tell you this truth, and I'm not. There's no difference between us except for the fact that I am like a weird hybrid kind of stepchild. I was raised by parents who were from the Bible Belt in Richmond, Virginia. I was raised in Washington, D.C. Metro. I was born in Alexandria, so you can punt a football over the river from downtown D.C. to where I was born. And so that cultural milieu, how it shaped my thinking, I'm just kind of weird. I don't know. So I'm Southern parents, D.C. kid, and then God leads me down to here, and so I realized. But here's one thing I know about you and me: we don't necessarily think the same. That's not a bad thing, but do you guys know that? We really don't about a lot of things, and so. And I'm not making fun of you. I just want you to see. I want to set up for you here just a couple minutes and show you kind of what has shaped your thinking to where you are and how you view the world today. You have an ingrained thinking, and you are like me, not real flexible to have it messed with. This can be good or bad depending on what the foundation of your thinking actually is. So if you're a freshman, who's a freshman here? welcome, first of all. Great to see you guys. Most of you guys were probably born 1997-ish. Is that right? Golly day, that's terrible. I was married in 1992. I'm feeling older about a minute. But anyway, God bless you for being so young. I was there once. And so just check this out. I got this from Church and Culture blog, and it made me kind of chuckle, but there's a point to all this. So if you were born 1997, 96, 95, 94, in those years, that's most of you, you were born into a world that you have never been alive in a lifetime of Princess Diana, Notorious Big, Jacques Cousteau. Is there anybody in here under 30 that actually knows who Jacques Cousteau is? Do you really? Cool, that's awesome. Yeah, if you don't know who he was a guy that was French. I think he was always old. And he did a lot of deep sea diving and tried to find stuff. That's pretty much his story. Mother Teresa, hybrid automobiles have always been mass produced in your lifetime. That's kind of cool. Google has always existed. And this is crime. You have never licked a postage stamp. That's criminal. I mean, because they tasted horrible. Everybody needs to experience that at least once. Email has become the formal communication, and casual communication is texting and tweeting. And so just so you know, it used to be like you would write a letter and put it in the mail, and that was formal communication. Now it's email, which is funny because I was just telling somebody earlier, when I communicate with people in my church, it's almost always by text. Never by phone, which I don't mind that. I don't like talking on the phone a whole lot more than you do. You guys hate talking on the phone, right? Am I right? All right. So I've learned that. For your entire life, there have been 4 foul-mouthed kids that have always been playing in South Park for your entire life. You're looking at me like I'm crazy, like you've never watched that. I haven't, but I know you have. You've always had Wi-Fi. The therapeutic use of marijuana has always been legal in a growing number of states in the U.S. in your lifetime. And Splenda has always been a way to sweeten your iced tea, which I think is kind of funny. But in your lifetime, you've always had Splenda. Any Splenda drinkers? No. See, that doesn't really shape your. Yeah. Thank you for being a Splenda drinkers in the room. I remember my last job. I always joke and call it my last real job before I went into the ministry. I worked with a guy who was really kind of New Age when New Age was new. Ish, and he was kind of like a modern day, I don't know, modern day kind of hippie thing. I'm not, but anyway, we were in D.C. But anyway, he was vegan, and he was kind of cool, and he carried a, shoulder bag, which is really cool now, but back then nobody did that. But anyway, and so, and he was natural everything. Like he drank soy milk, and he did all this stuff before it was cool. And so I remember sitting at a table with him in a restaurant. We would go out, everybody in our company would go out and eat, and he was on one end of the table, and I was on the other, and the sweetener was right here. And he said, "Hey, man, can you pass me the natural sweetener?" And I'm like, "You mean sugar?" But anyway, all that to say, you have a certain set of things that are happening in your life that are shaping the way you think. Your generation has never known. I'm not busting on you. I'm just saying this is the way it is. Your generation has never known life without the internet. I mean, Al Gore invented it just before you were born. And you've never known your life without that. And so it shapes the way you're thinking. Matter of fact, we don't really even know yet how much effect it has on the way we think, the internet. So we have instant access to information. We have it's an interesting day because through social media we have more connection than we ever have yet. They're telling us that people in your generation are more lonely than they've ever been. And so Facebook changes the way you think. And I know for you guys, it's kind of like Face Snoop. You never actually act like you're on Facebook, but I know you're on there. You just never put anything on there. You're Twitter, Instagram, and then checking everybody else. And it's funny how Facebook works, though, when you think about this. Even the statements that you make. So we look at our Facebook page. You know this is true. We look at our Facebook page. We see the number change. We're like, who unfriended me? Right? And so the statement that you can make just by unfriending somebody on Facebook. You guys know what I'm talking about. And so this shapes the way that you're thinking. You can see how many people love Jimmy Fallon and all the skits that he does, right? And you've never watched his show once. You watch every bit of it on YouTube. Isn't that awesome? Like no commercials, just pull it up. And so, but here's what I'm saying. It shapes the way that you're thinking. And here's the issue. Truth now is different. In secular world, truth is relative. Truth is something to which you arrive. And not only is that true, now truth is not arrived to until it's gone through the lens or the filter of popular opinion, most of which is expressed through social media. And so here's all I'm saying. you have a certain way that you think. And that didn't come to you in a vacuum. The world around you, the culture in which we live, it is working out and shaping the way that you think. And it's very important to understand that and then to know this truth, that the gospel of Jesus Christ is going to challenge the way that you think, and then the goal of the gospel is to become the foundation on which the framework of your thinking is built. And when the gospel came into the world, that's exactly what it did. And here's what I want you to know. We've been working a lot on this, those of us in church world, and looking at the scope of the church and how things are going with church in America. And I even shared with the real numbers and the real story with my church as I pastored or as I preached last Sunday, and how many churches a year are closing and how much of a deficit that is compared to the churches that are being planted. And then out of the churches that are planted, only about half of those make it. And so the church is in massive decline in America, and we're scrambling to try to figure out how we now intersect our culture with the gospel. And here's the thing, and so many people in the church are afraid. People in the church are afraid of the future. People in the church are afraid what's happening in our nation and how things are going to work out in government, and will there be persecution that rises up against the church. And here's the one thing I want to tell you. Here's the truth of the gospel on which you and I stand. It was made for a day like this. As a matter of fact, the only thing different between the day the gospel was introduced from the apostles into that culture and this culture in which we live is Instagram and iPhones. The thinking was about the same. It was pluralistic. It was relative, and everybody was just doing their thing. And here comes the gospel, and it invades the world, and invades the thinking. So here's what I want to do. Everything hinges on how you view the gospel. And kind of I guess this is my life ministry, and I keep big themes. One of the things that I'm trying to do in my personal ministry as I preach and teach the Bible is just reintroduce people to the fact that Jesus is the scope of the person of Jesus Christ is huge. And the scope of the gospel is just as big as he is. The American church widely has reduced the gospel to something that it's not, something far less. And so let me just tell you this truth, and I remind our church this often. The gospel of Jesus Christ is not how you get to heaven. That is the fruit of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The gospel of Jesus Christ is the story of Christ from eternity past to eternity future. And that story, that person intersected with our world and stepped into our history, and that is a really, really big deal. So let me just read through this story with you, starting in verse 8. And because of persecution, Paul and some of the guys come into Lystra, and I just want you to see how the gospel kind of intersects with this pagan world that they're stepping into. And there's a couple of things that Paul says in here that are really profound when it comes to the way we think. Verse 8, now at Lystra, there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, stand upright on your feet. And he sprang up and began walking. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, the gods have come down to us in the light of men. Barnabas they called Zeus, Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priests of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance to the city, brought oxen and garland to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifices with the crowds. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, saying, men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature like you are. What he's saying is we're human beings, just like you are. And we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that's in them. So just know this. The answer to Paul's question, why are you doing this, is because the people that they were dealing with had a certain framework of thinking. So they're responding in the only way that they know how. They're responding because they think what's caused these things to happen are the false gods that they've been worshiping and talking about and reading about for their entire lives. And so that's the only framework of thinking they have. Paul now has stepped in and challenged that. And he says, and I don't know if you noticed this, but in the translation I'm reading, it says good news. We also are men, in verse 15, of like nature like you. We're human beings like you, and we bring you good news. Now, here's my submission to you. That what Paul is saying there is much bigger than the English words good news. This is the verb. It's a verb in the Greek New Testament. The noun you've probably heard of, especially if you're studying in depth the New Testament, euangelion, which brings us through a bunch of stuff, but this transliterated word that we know as gospel. All right? So just remember this. The gospel is good news. It comes from a word that means good news, but when Paul's using this verb, which just means to declare the good news, he is telling them more than just, I have some good news for you. Like, he's not telling them that their wife's going to have a baby, or they just got a raise, or there's an extra piece of steak in the meat ration this week. He's not speaking that way. He's speaking of something much weightier than that. And then he presses them a little bit more in verse 16. Then he starts messing with their thinking even more. So I have this good news, and there's something connected to it. In past generations, he allowed all the nations to walk in their own way. Speaking of God. Yet he did not leave himself without witness, for he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. And so he's saying there's something that you don't know. That I'm bringing you this good news, this gospel, and it's more than just trying to make you a little bit happy. This is big news. This is intersecting your life right here, and I want you to know that all along, God has actually been at work in your life. You just didn't know it. And so Paul starts to try to bring them into a new framework. So there's a couple things that the gospel needs to do. So just if you carry this out of here, we're on the same page. The gospel is more. The gospel is more than just how you get to heaven. When you respond to the gospel, the result of that in your life is eternity with Christ. But there's more to it than that. The gospel is Jesus Christ and his story. And it's a big, big story. So big that it actually changes the framework of the way you and I view history. Because if we understand that history is wrapped around the person of Jesus Christ. As a matter of fact, I just got an email this morning. I got up early than I wanted to be. I was up about 5. And about midnight, one of our UNC Chapel Hill students had sent me an email. And the email, just in this same topic, the email basically said, I have a new roommate this year. She's a sophomore this year. She's a follower of Jesus. She came up through our teen group. I baptized her personally. And she has grown in Christ. She spent the summer with us and just given her life away this summer at the church in different ways. And she says, I have a new roommate, and she's a Christian, but she's come to do religious studies here. And it is really starting to shake her faith. And I wrote back and I said, well, what you need to know is that's what they intend to do. UNC Chapel Hill, great school on the end of intellectual education. The problem is that they don't believe in Christ. The chair of the religious studies in Chapel Hill is Bart Ehrman, who was a believer, went apostate, and then started writing books about all the books that are missing from the Bible that he doesn't believe in. I really don't even understand that argument. So you see the change in the framework. And so I wrote her back. I said, I'm going to pray for your friend and you, but just know this, that there is historical, grounded, sufficient reason to believe in the person of Jesus Christ. And it's through the framework of that thinking that you will hold tight to this truth and it will actually be working out in your life. But just know this, that the gospel gives you a new framework of how you view history. That's why Paul wrote to the Corinthians, I decided to know nothing about you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Is he shrinking a story down? No, he's actually making it bigger. Because we know Paul writes about all kinds of things other than what we would call the gospel, 1 Corinthians 15. Because everything is through the lens of the gospel. So the gospel cannot be reduced to how you get to heaven and have the effect that it should on your life. And when we make the gospel less than it is, it loses its power to be the strong foundation and framework that it should be. And so, here's what I say to my church, and I want to encourage you to this. Do not make Jesus something you add a little bit to your life. That's not the deal. And so many, I call it salt shaker, Mrs. Dash on chicken. So many people want to step into the church or just enough relationship with Jesus Christ so He make it a little bit better for me. He didn't come to do that. He came to get into your life and to bring your life into Him. I don't know how much you think of the big story of the Bible. Meta-narrative is the word sometimes used. If I use that word, I'm just meaning the big story. And the big story is creation, destruction, recreation, new creation. You see that all the way through the Scriptures, and you see God working out through the timeline of human history to bring those things about. And He's called you into this point of history to be in His story with Him. This is how big this is, and it shapes and changes the way you look at things, promise and fulfillment. So if all of history, just listen to this truth. I don't have time to dig into this more. I wish I did. But if all of history is founded and grounded in the person of Jesus Christ, and I'm here to tell you that it is. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and without Him was nothing made that was made. All of human history is grounded in the person of Jesus Christ. And that means I can't just add a little bit of Him to my life. But if I'm in His story, that means my story becomes complete in Him too. So just know this. The beauty of the gospel is that the power of the work of Christ as He gave His life in sacrifice, died and rose again, historical event. If you're struggling with that truth, it doesn't matter what the secular world does with the dating system. So they can call it BC, BCE, or is that what they're doing now? CE, BCE, CE, before Common Era. Okay, it doesn't change the fact, if they don't want to use BCAD, it doesn't change the fact that all the dating for the entire world in the calendar system changed at the advent of Jesus coming to earth. He owns history. He is history. And when you get that, then you begin to start to see the foundation that He is. So it changes the way we view history. It gives me framework for that. But then it changes the way that I view the world around me now. It gives me a new worldview. And this is what I want to impress upon you. That when Paul is telling this to these pagans in Acts 14, he's saying, I've got much more than just good news for you. Jesus didn't show up and go, man, life is going to be grand now that I'm here. There's some truth to that, but there's actually life when Jesus shows up has a lot more meaning to it now. Life when Jesus shows up now starts to make sense. If you put the gospel as the basis and the foundation of the framework you're thinking, it actually begins to make sense of everything else that's going on around you. And when you read what's going on around you through that lens, it changes everything by the way you see it. And I just want to tell you, it needs to. It needs to. So here's what I know. I'm cool. I'm totally cool with the fact that you have a certain framework of thinking based on the culture and the life that I was too. There's nothing I can do about it, right? You like that? There's nothing you can do about it. You were raised in a generation that you were chosen for that generation. If I'm seeing the way the history is working out, and I'm reading 1 Corinthians 12, right? You can look at that later, but God chose you to be born in this day, for this hour, for this time. You're in this university, obviously looking to shape and get your education and pattern your life toward a life in the gospel. At least I hope that's true. Even if you're not going into full-time ministry, I hope you're looking to live your life in the pattern of the gospel so that God can work out in your life. You were chosen for that moment. And you have nothing, there's nothing you can do about the way you think. There's nothing you can do about that. And there's nothing you need to do about that. except for the fact that now you need to begin to view that the gospel has intercepted your life. And that if you begin to work out the big picture of the gospel in the way you think, it will begin to change the way you view everything around you. And it'll change the way you view the big stuff. See, I'm starting a series in 3 weeks or 2.5 weeks in our church just to talk about truth, God, marriage, sexuality, all of those things. And I understand that you are looking at a landscape of popular opinion and looking over a landscape where many of you, and can I just say this, if you're unsure about those things, if you're unsure how you should react or think about those things and the whole marriage debate and the Supreme Court thing, that's okay. Just nobody's mad at you if you don't think about it the same way I do. But here's my urgency to you. It's time for you to look at the big picture of the gospel, how Jesus is working through human history, how he's come to work in your life. Let that become the lens that you think so that you can come to conclusions of truth. Because here's what I know. Truth is not relative. I don't know if you know that or not, but truth is not relative. The whole argument that what could be true for you may not be true for somebody else can't be true. Truth is foundational. Truth has been given. It's not arrived at, it's received. And it comes from God, and that shapes and changes my thinking. So, can I just tell you this, since we're on this topic? I think it's very possible for a Christian person to speak with truth and grace and love to someone with whom they do not agree. I think it's very possible that's what your generation is called to do. They're called to do what we and older generations, unfortunately, we did not do. And that is handle the truth with love and grace and know why you believe what you believe. Let me just take you quickly through some thought. If you want to look through Acts later on, you'll see this. This gospel, this truth, intersects the thinking of everybody in the world. There isn't anybody that doesn't touch. So you can just go through and look at it this way. Acts 14, where we are, pagans. Gets pagans who believe in a plurality of gods and all kinds of things. Acts 15, religious people. All right, so if you remember the story of Acts 15, it's people who are Jewish, now believers, some are, some aren't, trying to figure out the whole works and faith thing, and it gets right in their stuff and changes the way they think. Acts 16, militants people. Guy in the military ends up seeing the way Christians are handling themselves and comes to faith in Christ. Acts 17, the educated, Mars Hill, or the Areopagus. Paul speaks again to pagans, but these are the educated and the intellectual elite. There isn't anybody that this truth does not intersect. And the framework of this thing, here's what I'm trying to tell you. The gospel was made for this day. All right, if you walk out of here and you get that, and you're thinking to yourself, I don't know how I use the gospel in the day I'm living in. Nobody wants... The gospel was made for this day. And if you take away Instagram and iPhones, as I said, we're living in a culture just like the culture in which the gospel of Jesus Christ was first introduced. When you understand, watch this, when you understand that all of human history is couched in the person of Jesus Christ, then he becomes sufficient for today. Let me say that again. When you understand that all of human history is couched in the person of Jesus Christ, then he becomes sufficient for you today. And you begin to see the framework of your life and what he's doing. So here's the good news. Jesus didn't come to mess with you. He came to call you into life. In him is life. You remember these verses? He is the way, the truth, the life. In him there is life. Without him there is no life at all. These things are more than just you getting to heaven. These are the things that shape the way you think. These are the things that give you the framework to live solid in the person of Jesus Christ today. So here's the thing, pastoring like I do. So many Christians, I see so many Christians just grappling and grabbing and scraping and clawing, trying to get through the day-to-day and looking to add a little bit of faith to try to help them. It doesn't have to be that way. Life is hard. Bad stuff happens. Jesus never changes, and he is sufficient for you. The only way that you can know that is to make sure that he is working in your thinking. So you have the gospel of Jesus Christ, almost there. The gospel of Jesus Christ changes the way you view history. It changes, gives you a framework to view what's going on around you today, and now it gives you a better view of what the future would be. Here's the one thing. I've been reading through Fox's Book of Martyrs. I don't know if you've ever done that. John Fox was, he lived in the 1500s, the 16th century. The book came out, I think, kind of mid-late 16th century, and he was a scholar, so he went through and he was going through all these old writings, and he's looking at the early church, and it actually went up way up in the church history. So the beginning of the church is only about that much of the book, and all the rest of it keeps going up through some of the guys that you probably know. But he's talking about people that you and I have never heard of. There goes through 10 great church persecutions that happened within the first about 2.5 centuries of the church. And it's crazy the way these people, I mean, I'm almost ashamed when I read it. I mean, what these people would do because the way that their thinking had changed so radically. And we're talking about people who, they had no idea of a creator. They come into the realization that history is grounded in God and that God is doing this on purpose and that he's come after us, and they start to change, and then the persecution hits. The craziest thing about Fox's Book of Martyrs as you read through that is some of these guys who were being, and women, just being, I mean, horrific what they were doing to them. They would burn them with metal. They were putting hooks in their body, metal hooks in their body, and ripping their flesh out. They were scourging them. They would stretch them until their joints popped out of socket. They would throw them in the Colosseums and different places and let wild animals eat them alive. They would burn them slowly to death. All kinds of stuff that they would do. Skin them alive. And what's so crazy is that story after story, as John Fox writes that, and then he starts saying, yeah, but there was this guard who watched these two women who graciously and gladly gave their life for the one they knew. And he, knowing at that moment, if he converted, if he said that he was now a believer, they were going to kill him next. And guard after guard, watching the witness of these people. I don't know if you know the English word witness comes from the Greek word martyr. And they're watching these people die in such a way, in much horrific ways, but the way their attitude was and the way their thinking was, that people were converting to Christianity because of watching somebody else die for their faith. Now you're going, what? How? I mean, how can somebody do that? Here's the answer. They look at the future way different now. Hope. Hope. The one thing nobody can take. It completely changes the way I view every day. Knowing that there's something coming after this, and it's going to be way more life than what I had in my life on earth. And I put my hope in Christ. It's changed the way I think about the future, and I live my life pressing for the mark. I think that's why Paul was the way he was. I press toward the mark of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. The gospel is the framework of my life. This is how I think. This is where I arrive to truth. So the gospel, now, get this, and by the way, homiletic students, here's my theme. The gospel is not an intellectual exercise. It has to make it to the heart. But know this truth, unless it begins to shape the way you think, you will never fully realize its sufficiency in your life now. And Jesus is sufficient for your life. The gospel is the sufficiency of your life. And your thinking must be determined by that. If it is, then you won't follow so many of the generations of American Christians that went before you, going to church on Sunday, and then clawing and scraping and groping, looking for some kind of sufficient help for the week. But you can live your life completely satisfied by the sufficiency of Jesus Christ. He is big. He is great. He is good. And you are His if you walk with Him that way. So my challenge to you this way is this. More than an intellectual exercise, but know this. The gospel must intersect the way you think. And if it does, then it begins to do in your life what God intends it to do. So don't spend your life being worried about if you're going to heaven. Spend your life being worried about whether or not you are walking with and knowing the living God and the truth that He's given you. Heaven's going to happen if you're there. And then let Him work out your life the way that He intends to, and you'll find your sufficiency in Him. Let Him change your thinking. Can I pray with you? Let's pray together. Father, for the goodness of who You are, God, I'm thankful. Lord, You are awesome. You are mighty. You own this world. You own history. And God, You have shown Yourself so good throughout it all. And I pray that every person in this room, anybody maybe listening or watching online, would just know this truth, that You have put Your grace on us even in the years that we did not know You. That's how good You are. And God, You came after us. And so here's my prayer for us. God, let Your sufficiency control the way we think, act, look. God, the way that we have our outlook of the future. God, let that be by Your work. Let us find Your sufficiency. You are sufficient. You are good. You do love us. You did die for us, Christ. And so we thank You for that. And so I ask that You guide and direct these folks as they study, as they look at the world around them, as they try to get a handle on the way that they'll live their life and think. God, let You be control. I pray that You'll be the foundation. And God, I know You'll work out everything, and they will know